It is overtime here again at Old Favorite Friday, where we are continuing the conversation about 21st Amendment Brewing's Hell or High Watermelon Wheat Beer. This is a beer that I have not had in a long time. This was suggested for me to revisit for Old Favorite Friday. I remembered really enjoying this beer when I first had it. It's actually one of the few beers from this brewery that I've had. At least in the state of Florida. I had some of their beer when I was out west in California on a trip years and years ago, but I have not had the pleasure of having a lot of beers from this brewery because they're just not available in our home state here. I don't know, is there any beers that you've seen from them down here?
At least back in the day, the oyster stout they had around here for a minute, and their black IPA I was a fan of, so I would pick that up on occasion when it was around. But yeah, anywhere I'd find them, they'd have like maybe 3 or 4 SKUs, and that was it.
Yeah, so it's limited, but this one is the one that's most popular down here. This is readily available, and this is a really interesting fruit beer because you don't see a lot of beers using watermelon. Right. I remember a good friend of mine, Phil Palmisano, used to work here at Barrel of Monks, now works for Canarchy. He loved this beer so much that he tried to replicate it as a home brewer for years. So anytime I see this beer, I always think about Phil. So shout out to Phil. And this is when I was first introduced to this beer, was around that time. I started drinking craft beer in the early 2000s and was well aware of like Sea Dog Blueberry. There's a lot of blueberry, raspberry beers. And this was the first time I ever saw a beer use watermelon. And this beer is 20 years old.
Wow.
At least 20 years old, if not a little bit older. And I think it accomplishes something, and I don't know how the recipe's changed over time, but drinking it right now, I think it accomplishes something that a lot of those other beers didn't do. And that is staying relatively dry, staying relatively clean, and not smacking you over the head with inauthentic fruit flavor, and really being a beer with a hint of fruit, not a fruit juice with a hint of beer. What are your thoughts about this beer so far?
Yeah, so I really like it, and I could see it being, especially, I knew some of their beers were, quite old. Like one of my favorite IPAs of theirs is, I found out, was like from 2004, but I did not realize that this particular brand was that old, but I could see it being like kind of a precursor to some of the fruited beers we have now, because like you said, it strikes me very much, I know it says wheat beer, so it strikes me as an American wheat where it's very crisp, clean. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of yeast character, which I think is good because I think would detract from the watermelon. But then you do get like a sweetness. The watermelon to me is surprisingly really like it tastes like watermelon. As funny as that sounds, that is hard to do. And so it's very well balanced, but I could see where someone probably had this and then 10 years later, like your friend trying to replicate it, and then we wind up with what we have now. But yeah, it's a really good crusher for a fruit beer.
I see it. I always do a little bit of research on these beers, just looking and see what the scores are on it, what people are saying about the beer before I dive into it. And one of the things I noticed was that people were saying that this beer just didn't have enough fruit flavor, and I could not disagree more. This is what I want in a fruit beer. I mean, this has been around for a long time. Once again, kind of an OG when it comes to the fruit beers and the American fruit beers. We've had lambics and stuff fruited for a long time, but when it comes to the American fruit beers, and it does exactly what I always want. I want it to be subtle. I want it to be clean. I want it to be identifiably a beer. Mm-hmm. I want someone to look at this and try it and go, oh, this is not a milkshake. This is not a smoothie that I got at the gym. This is a beer with a hint of fruit flavor. And I think it's accomplished as well as any fruit beer that I've had.
Yeah, and I agree with that, because one thing I was going to comment on is, and I've been guilty of it and have friends who've done it, but you'll say something like, oh, I can almost smell bitterness or sweetness. Those really aren't things you can smell. So sometimes when they're like, doesn't have enough fruit flavor, enough this or that, some of it, like you said, because you see your beer, if you were to see a beer like this now, it would look like a milkshake.
Yeah.
So it's more of a mental, in my opinion, thing than just like, because this beer to me is very much watermelon. You could blindfold me and I'd be like, that's watermelon. So personally, I couldn't see how much more you would need or want to add. So I would, like you, I would disagree. I think this has more than enough fruit flavor and very non-synthetic, which is what I like more about it. So
it tastes completely authentic to me. Yeah. And it's too often you have like a strawberry candy, and then you have a strawberry and you go, these don't taste anything like each other, right? Banana flavored candy, often that doesn't taste anything like banana. I think that we do that too often in the beer industry is we end up having beers that are supposed to be a certain fruit and they taste like the synthetic version of that thing. They don't taste like the real version of this thing. My son eats a whole watermelon every day. He's a fruitarian apparently. So I have a lot of watermelon in the house. I eat watermelon all the time. This is what watermelon tastes like. And I love the fact that there is, you notified a little bit of sweetness in here, but there's also some background bitterness. This has not a bitter finish, but a hint of bitterness on the finish. It's clean as a whistle, right? It's absolutely refreshing. And it packs all that flavor punch in there. I mean, listen, bravo. This is extremely well done for the kind of beer that this is going to be.
Yeah, and one thing that you kind of touched on, and not that I'm saying it is a one-to-one, but it does remind me, if you were to take away some of that yeast character, it actually reminds me of some of the really well done Belgian fruit beers, because like you said, it's a beer first, kind of fruit second, but it really blends well together. Like it almost, if you could live in that world, obviously there's some tannins and things that would be different, but it almost remind me of when they make, like, now it's popular to make like different fruited wines where you don't just use grapes. So it almost reminds me of that, where it's an alcoholic beverage, it's well constructed. I mean, can't see it now, but the lacing is beautiful and the head was great, but you still get that fruit. So it is very much, it reminds me, I shouldn't say old school, it just reminds me of something that was really well done and just not how much could we cram into it.
Well, that's the goal. We all too much it comes down to is that how can we turn this flavor up to 11 and how can we just bombard people? And I think that there's plenty of people that love those beers, and there's some beers in that category that I really enjoy. But day to day, if I'm grabbing a beer, I'd much rather have something like this. I'd much rather enjoy something like this. Great recommendation, putting this back on my radar after many, many years. I was very happy to find it and be able to talk about it here for Old Favorite Friday. So please keep the suggestions coming in. We'd love to hear your opinion about this beer. We'd love to hear your opinion about any beers that you think we should be drinking. And please poke around the channel, like, subscribe, see some more conversation with myself and Ralph, some other guests talking about amazing, great, classic beers that we all love. And we'll see you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.